Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Spacepower Forum today. We're really pleased that Lt Gen John Thompson could join us to provide us his perspectives that he's seeing and what's happening in space. Now, Lt Gen Thompson is a commander of U.S. Space Force's Space and Missile Systems Center, which is responsible for developing, acquiring, and sustaining military space systems. So welcome, JT, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start by giving you the opportunity to share your thoughts on the current status of the national security space enterprise, the critical challenges that you and your team are facing, and then just what your top priorities are as you look into the future. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Much appreciated. As I mentioned to you earlier when we were in the private chat mode, we really do appreciate the entire United States Space Force, the Department of the Air Force, really do appreciate the role that Air Force Association and the Mitchell Institute specifically are playing. I know you've had a interesting week at AFA. You've had Major General John Shaw from Space Operations Command speak on Monday. Yesterday, you had Mr. Sean Barnes from the Assistant Secretary's office talk, and today you've got me. So I guess if this were the Discovery Channel, it'd be sort of like Shark Week, right? You've got Space Week going, and I'll try not to disappoint. We really appreciate the forum that you all provide us, the opportunity to talk to key stakeholders like are online today. And then just a special shout out just for everybody. I've already talked to you privately about this, but Camilla Gunzinger from your team has just been remarkable in setting up this this virtual environment for us to have this little conversation on. So in terms of major takeaways for today's discussion, I think, and the last time I talked to the Mitchell Institute was in December timeframe, and I talked very specifically about the challenges ahead for calendar year 2020. At that time, when I spoke to the Mitchell Institute, a global pandemic was not one of those challenges I had on my list. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about, throughout today's session, and I'll have some examples later on, about how we've continued to accomplish our mission despite the challenges, the roadblocks, the speed bumps, whatever you want to call them, that have been put in place via the pandemic, the telework environment, the connectivity challenges, the lack of travel, making sure that the defense industrial base, that critical infrastructure remains open and well-resourced so they continue to make progress on our important programs. Last December, I also highlighted that in November of last year, we declared full operational capability of our SMC 2.0 re-architecture. And just from the standpoint of initiatives, let me just touch on what I think that has accomplished for us. First of all, it's changed the way that we think fundamentally in space acquisition about transitioning capability to the warfighter. That is particularly evident in things like software-based systems where we're trying to use agile DevOps approaches to field operationally relevant capability to warfighters more quickly. But it's also shown in all of the prototyping efforts. And as I've mentioned in the past, we have adopted NDAA 16, middle tier acquisition section 804 authorities across a number of our key programs in the portfolio. So we think we're getting after stuff for the warfighter in a much quicker manner. We brought to bear some modern acquisition capabilities, tools, and processes. We've taken advantage of the authorities that the Department of the Air Force, the Department of Defense, and the Congress have given us. And we're trying to get after those more rapid authorities, whether we're in the developmental phase of a program or whether that program is a long time in sustainment. The COVID environment did stress the system considerably in the execution of those programs. but I'm very proud to say that we maintained, maybe with a small efficiency hit, our progress on just about everything in the portfolio. And we'll talk about things like virtual critical design reviews and things like that a little bit later in my remarks. And then we continued under SMC 2.0 to break down barriers between previous stovepipe systems and organizations to truly take an enterprise focus on delivering space capability. Gone are the days, I think, as we move into the future, of every satellite having to have its own unique ground control segment. And we fueled a lot of that with the rapid innovation and prototyping stuff that I've already talked about. All of this SMC 2.0 change, and many of you are familiar with our tagline associated with that, which is Epic Speed, where Epic stands for Enterprise Partnership, Innovation, Culture, Speed, has been focused really on going faster. Now that doesn't mean going faster in an undisciplined manner. That doesn't mean running with scissors. That doesn't mean, hey, we want to go faster and we don't want to be transparent with our stakeholders about it. It really does mean speed with discipline, making schedule and delivery of capability a key performance parameter for our warfighters. Some people out there in today's audience and elsewhere may think that, well, why JT? Why are you and SMC and many other space acquisition organizations so focused on speed? Doesn't history show that you've delivered the best weapon systems of any nation on Earth for the space domain? Aren't our 30 plus GPS satellites in our constellation, aren't they the envy of the world in terms of accuracy and reliability? Aren't they so good that they have become pervasive across not just defense, but also the economy and around the planet? Your launch programs have been tremendously successful, particularly the national security space launch efforts. Your missile warning capabilities are relied on every minute of every day. Those systems, what's wrong with what we've done in the past? And the simple answer to that question is, it's the threat. The threat is rapidly changing, evolving, and getting better. Almost all of our military capabilities depend on space capabilities. Huge portions of our economy depend on space. Americans and our allies depend on space every minute, maybe every second of every day. So if you think about it in terms of just elements of national power, air power, naval power, infrastructure, financial systems, agriculture, networks, communications, heck, even entertainment. I could go on and on. Our adversaries understand our dependence on space and are taking actions against that. We have to protect the global commons of space. It's really, really something that's hard to see, right? The most visible part of the space enterprise is probably launch, right? Everybody loves watching a rocket take off. But much of it is impossible to see on orbit. So it's really, really hard to see, but it's so essential to our free society and how it functions. So I guess I'd summarize there by just saying it can be out of sight. It is out of so when we talk about the threat in the environment, the space domain environment that we operate in every day as a nation, a lot of times people will come to me and say, hey, you know, you can't talk about it because it's all classified. It's out of sight and it's all highly classified. And while I agree that it is highly classified in especially many programs that we currently work on, there is a lot of publicly available data now on the development of counterspace capabilities by our nation's adversaries. These nations are not sympathetic to that US objective I mentioned earlier of protecting the global commons of space and keeping space accessible for peaceful spacefaring nations. In fact, I would characterize a strong emphasis by a couple of our adversaries on weaponizing space. As I mentioned, there's lots of great examples of how people can get smart about the threat. NASIC, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, produced a document in December of 18 called Competing in Space. DIA has produced a document also unclassified, Challenges to Security in Space last year. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, did a 2020 space threat assessment, and even the Secure World Foundation recently did a global Counterspace Capabilities document. Just those 4 documents represent over 300 pages of unclassified data on what our adversaries are doing in space. It's not a pretty picture. In fact, it's a pretty scary picture. So I would encourage everybody to go out and take a look at those resources. And I'll just let everybody know that if you take a look at the classified reports, the story doesn't get any better. If you look at our pacing adversary, China, recently successful prototype launches of the Long March 5B rocket demonstrate a Chinese capability to put upwards of 20 tons on orbit. They continue testing reusable launch capability. They are very, very close. In fact, they tried earlier this week and had to delay a launch of completing their Beidou constellation, which is analogous to our GPS constellation. They have numerous lunar activities that cause some of us some concerns. The CSIS report indicated that China's strategic support force, so in other words, their space force, their electromagnetic spectrum force, and their cyber force, quote, has begun training specialized units with direct ascent ASAT weapons. That report also highlights aggressive proximity operations testing, in other words, maneuvering satellites close to other satellites, directed energy, and RF jamming technology development. The Russians continue to be active in trying to disrupt our space capabilities as well. And I think that that's especially due to the New START treaty expiration that's on the horizon. Quote, Russia has not publicly announced the development of a new co-orbital ASAT, but they've made significant progress developing their air-launched ASAT compatible with the MiG-31. And then, of course, late last year in November timeframe, I think everybody's familiar with the well-reported maneuvering observation satellites near one of our critical national satellites on orbit. And that's just all stuff, Dave, that's in the space domain, right? That's the on-orbit stuff that's above the surface of the Earth, right? Here on the planet's surface, China, Russia, other nations and non-state actors continue to pose threats in cybersecurity, industrial espionage, and supply chain security. These things, if you just read those reports, these things are not distant future threats. They are happening now. They're evolving and adapting their capabilities at a rapid pace. Speaking of rapid pace, I mean, I think the Chinese have announced that they're targeting up to 40 launches this year. So this is all very concerning. These are very real threats. They're out there today, and they're all increasing. The taxpayer pays me to keep an eye on those adversaries and respond as necessary. Now, that may be something that the audience is used to hearing a warfighter talk about, you know, a Major General John Shaw, a Major General Stephen Whiting, even the Chief of Space Operations and Commander of U.S. Spacecom, General Raymond. But I think that expectation should also be made by taxpayers of the acquisition professionals within the Department of the Air Force, seeing a threat, recognizing a threat, and responding to that threat. This is really peer competition. And it's not just military peer competition, it's also economic, diplomatic, and informational. So as a nation, really, we have to decide, if this is a competition, do we want to win it? Well, I do want to win it. And so how do we win it? We field operationally relevant space capabilities faster than our adversaries. We address their capabilities directly with our capabilities. As Secretary Esper has said, we outcompete, we out-innovate, and we out-hustle them. We impose costs on them to deter them. And so I'm very proud to be part of this larger ecosystem, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force, the United States Space Force, and the Space and Missile Systems Center that I command, in terms of we are doing everything we can to modernize our acquisition processes for speed, to ensure that we maintain that innovative technical edge to deter, and if necessary, defeat any threats in, from, and to space. It's not about militarizing space, it's about protecting the global commons for the common good, and we have to get faster at it, okay? So thanks very much for the opportunity to just make a few opening comments there from my notes. I look forward, I think, Dave, you have some questions for me, and then I look forward to questions from the audience as we go ahead and proceed with this event. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, JT, for that context. And thanks much to you and for all that your team's doing to develop the world's greatest space force, particularly this close to its birth. You get us a very nice tour de force in the context of threats, and you mentioned SMC 2.0 and the tie between the threats and the need to be able to accelerate the fielding of space systems. Now, SMC 2.0 was launched back in 2018. Could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the most impactful changes that you've seen coming out of this initiative over the last 2 years? And how do you see the 2.0 initiative carrying forward into the Space Force?
Yeah, so when we declared full operational capability on SMC 2.0, Dave, we realized that that was not the destination, right? It wasn't a slap the table, we're done, right? That journey of being more enterprise focused, to develop new partnerships, to add more innovation into our ecosystem, to change our culture away from risk aversion to something more akin to being able to take smart risks, and to do all of that in order to go faster was going to take longer than a couple of years. Made great strides over those couple of years and continue to make great strides, but I don't think there's ever there might be an SMC 3.0, but it's always going to be a constant journey to that. I could talk for well over this whole hour on our modernization, and I could give a lot of examples. You know, I could talk about how in the military satellite communications area, our protected anti-jam tactical SATCOM, or our PATS program, has embraced digital engineering, digital systems engineering. They've brought the warfighter in much earlier with enhanced modeling and simulation, and how they're trying to enable the protected tactical waveform, which is an encrypted waveform for our warfighters, to integrate not only on our military satellite communication systems, but also on the military satellite communication systems of our allies, and on commercial networks, which is I think really, really important. I think I'd probably rather highlight, though, what I think is one of the biggest changes of SMC 2.0. It's a little bit organizational, and it's a lot programmatic and mindset. And that's the stand-up of our cross-mission ground and communications enterprise, which just celebrated within the last couple of weeks its first birthday. That small team of folks has consolidated over $4.5 billion worth of data transport, tactical, and operational command and control programs. That's where our United States Space Force software factory, many of you have heard of it, called Kobayashi Maru, is located. The successes include space domain awareness applications delivered in as little as 57 days, as opposed to sometimes upwards of 5 years in broader, older legacy programs. Those apps, which are being used right now by our warfighters, we're able to reduce operator workload from 3 hours to 15 minutes per day because they were able to automate functions that the warfighter was used to doing in Excel spreadsheets. Our Enterprise Ground Services, or EGS program, is also in the Cross Mission Ground organization. They've been able to take their prototyping into early operations support for the SBIRS program, accelerating, surging that effort. And then, of course, across the Agile software acquisition portfolio, delivering Space C2 applications to both CSPOC and NSDC, averaging less than 70 days from requirement identification to delivery. That team has won numerous awards, and I couldn't be more proud of them. We have had a number of great engagements, not just with the warfighters, but with our board of directors, if you will, over on Capitol Hill. We look forward to bringing more successes to them and talking to them more about how we've structured this cross-mission program. SMC, I think, to get on to the second part of your question, will play a key role in the modernization and transformation of the U.S. Space Force that's coming up. We've operating through an environment of significant change, but there's a real sense of excitement here on my team to be part of the newest service within the Department of Defense. And we feel like we've been a major player in writing that next chapter that extends to all of our partners in the United States Space Force, extends to other government organizations, other space stakeholders that we deal with every day, and I think even extends to a number of our allies and our commercial partners in terms of how important it is. I know John Shaw earlier this week talked about the 8,500 people that volunteered to opt in to the United States Space Force, and we're really looking forward to that personnel conversion over time so that we can join General Raymond and Chief Toberman as members of the United States Space Force.
Thanks for that rundown. And we heard yesterday from Sean Barnes about the effects of COVID-19 on the space industrial base and what initiatives are being undertaken to support them through the pandemic. What effects are you seeing from COVID-19 on SMC's activities? And given how active SMC has been throughout the pandemic, how have you been able to mitigate the associated risks?
Yeah, I saw Mr. Barnes's remarks yesterday on this topic, and they were absolutely spot on. Like a lot of other organizations, Space and Missile Systems Center at all of our operating locations has been on mandatory telework unless you need to perform a mission essential task at one of the installations. If you need to work in a vault or a skiff doing highly classified work, if your work must remain on track, like some of our very key source selections, everybody's been in that mandatory telework situation for 3 months now, 92 days exactly as of today. We modified our work environments to enable teams to be able to collaborate better and to do that work safely from home. The first couple of weeks were rugged. I know everybody else, there's probably a bunch of people listening to me saying, "Sing it to me, sister," right? There's a lot of people have learned those first couple of weeks that Outlook email is not a chat room, right? And so, but the other technical ways to collaborate, and there are many of them, too many to mention, that we have perfected over these past 3 months, I think really speak volumes to what we've been able to do. Many of you are aware that we delayed the GPS-3 SV3, the Space Vehicle 3 launch, until later this month. Currently planned for on or about the 30th of June. And we did that because we wanted to protect the mission, and we wanted to protect the people associated with that mission, the folks who had to execute it in both the launch part of the business and the early orbit checkout. We had to make sure that the facilities and the process and procedures in place were COVID-19 compliant. And we made that happen. And so that launch is back on track. We remain focused on delivering capability to the warfighter. I can talk about the Space Enterprise Consortium Other Transaction Agreement. Just in January, we got the ceiling increased on that contractual vehicle from $500 million to $1.4 billion. And since then, we continue to make awards against that contractual vehicle for enhanced weather system, for protected tactical SATCOM, payload prototypes for Space C2, for GPS user equipment, and things like that. As the team was continuing to execute against the critical efforts associated with that consortium OTA, they're also conducting the source selection for the follow-on to the Space Enterprise Consortium, which we call Spec Reloaded. That RFP hit the street in March, right in the middle of the pandemic. $12 billion contract ceiling, 10-year award period for prototyping across the Space Enterprise Consortium membership, which is well north of 350 members. Those proposals were received, those evaluations are underway, and we're on contract to complete the evaluations and the awards probably in the September timeframe, all despite COVID-19. GPS-3F and another critical remote sensing program, weather systems, follow-on microwave, completed critical design reviews in a virtual environment. I think that's remarkable in that old hands like myself and many others, probably you too, Dave, know the face-to-face interpersonal contact required to close out a critical design review on a major weapon system, and to do that virtually is really remarkable. So the 3F, the GPS 3F closed out their CDR campaign in just a year on schedule. We continue to plan for that launch for the GPS 3 in parallel, GPS 3, Space Vehicle 3, in parallel to all of that work. And then the weather system follow-on microwave got its milestone B certification here in mid-May. In the small launch environment, Secretary Lord and Dr. Roper have both commented about how important small launch is to our enterprise. And I can't give you the details right now, but I would anticipate here very shortly some very critical Defense Production Act awards to our small launch providers to keep that industry going. So I could go on and on, Dave. I could talk about the AEHF-6 launch. I could talk about the U.S. Space Force 7 launch just this past May. Impacts to the industrial base, I think. That data was available because we were able to very quickly send out a survey to the 350 plus members of the Space Enterprise Consortium, which represent in many ways the entire space industrial base, and get feedback from them. The actions that we've taken have been well reported in the media, in terms of making contract awards and no cost contract extensions liberally available to contractors, maximizing progress payments, and a number of other factors, including sometimes as simple as contacting local communities and emphasizing that certain businesses in those local communities are defense industrial-based participants and therefore represent critical infrastructures and should be not impacted by stay-at-home orders. So lots of great stuff going on, and I don't want to take up any more time talking about it, but I'm happy. I know there's media and my other stakeholders, many of them on the line. I'm happy to talk one-on-one with folks here over the next few weeks to kind of parlay even more details on what we've been able to accomplish in this difficult environment.
Well, congratulations on your success. It's really outstanding and a testimony for your skills in being able to conquer COVID-19 and not let it conquer you.
Yeah.
Now, JT, the last time you were here, you expressed optimism that the creation of a Space Acquisition Council could help the space enterprise operate better, go faster, take advantage of more partnerships, and introduce innovation in the space acquisition domain. What's your perspective now that the council is formally stood up, and what effects do you see it having both on the Space and Missile Systems Center and the space enterprise writ large?
Yeah, so Dave, I'm still really, really optimistic about the Space Acquisition Council, and it's because I've seen it in action now personally 3 different times. Not only are the statutory members there in the flesh engaged on the subject matter, so the Undersecretary of the Air Force, Dr. Roper in his role as the chair, General Raymond wearing the hats of both the Chief of Space Operations and the Commander of U.S. Spacecom, the Director of the NRO, Director Scalise, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Steve Katay. But they have invited other key players in the space ecosystem to participate in those events. Myself, Dr. Derek Tournier from Space Development Agency, Mr. Kevin Fahey from the Undersecretary of Defense for ANS, Mr. Randy Walden from the Department of the Air Force's RCO, and a number of other key players. They're taking on meaty topics, things like how do we go faster, how do we do better in space acquisition via digital engineering and some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier. How do we help the defense or the space industrial base? So the survey that I talked about and that Mr. Barnes talked about yesterday was actually commissioned by the Space Acquisition Council in terms of how do we rapidly get out there and find out critical data about the space industrial base. Hey, we've got the Space Enterprise Consortium, OTA, let's survey the members of that consortium. Lots of work and discussions, continuing collaborations on architectures. So I'm very happy with how this is. Secretary Barrett laid out a very clear vision for that team to be lean, agile, and forward-looking. Have the SAC help us forge the Space Force into that kind of impactful organization going into the future. And I've just seen great engagement from them, not just from the principals, but from the other people around the room. So very happy.
Very good. Now, the space domain is undoubtedly going to play a central role in DoD's vision for joint all-domain command and control, and has already been incorporated into field tests. But we've heard that the Space Development Agency envisions its transport layer of data relay satellites plugging directly into JADC2 and unifying the various space-based sensors that are an integral part of the JADC2 vision. How's SMC integrating with JADC2?
Yeah, so I can't go into all of the detail on that because, again, that would just take too long. But I will tell you that particularly our space command and control folks here and our portfolio architect folks are absolutely plugged into the larger JADC2 and ABMS efforts. First of all, we are fully aligned with Dr. Tremier and SDA on his space transport layer work, and Mr. Preston Dunlap, who is the chief architect for ABMS and running with a lot of the Department of the Air Force's JADC2 work thus far, has really been a great partner for us. We've hosted the entire ABMS community out here for a very large 2-day meeting earlier this year before the pandemic hit. Lots of deep dive discussions across the entire architecture. We have co-leads, space domain co-leads for each of the different efforts that the JADC2 team has underway. We've been a critical part of the demos that have been accomplished so far, and the 3 remaining demos that will be conducted here within the next year. Probably the biggest effort that we have in support is the Unified Data Library, or you may hear some people call it Data One, which is a data repository that's unclassified, secret, and top secret instantiations that can currently pull over $40 million or 40 million pieces of data, in a day. The Kobayashi Maru folks in our software factory are making tremendous strides in that, along with a number of our other data science folks. And so we feel like we've been fully integrated, as you might expect, in something called all domain. We feel like the space domain and the capabilities that we bring have been fully integrated in that, and that's the way that JADC2 will be successful across all the services.
Very good. Now, Project Global Lightning is an example of current experimentation to use commercial proliferated SATCOM for comms resilience. What have you learned from that project so far, and what other commercial partnerships is SMC pursuing to improve the resilience of space communications?
Yeah. So Dave, that's a great question. I think, as you mentioned, partnerships is really critical throughout this partnership. So as you know, Project Global Lightning is actually an Air Force Research Lab run project, but our team from my portfolio architect duty section, my experts on SATCOM integration have been working very closely with AFRL on that effort. I don't want to speak for the AFRL folks, but from my perspective, I think the key takeaways that they're finding in Global Lightning is that terminal fielding and platform integration remain a challenge, and those are some priority things going forward, that once we get out of the Global Lightning experimentation, if you will, that we're really going to have to get serious about attacking. We've got to have a deliberate enterprise approach to terminals. We can't just keep, as I mentioned earlier, on ground segments. In a very similar vein, we can't just keep building unique terminals for every new system that we field. We've got to have some commonality. Working with the warfighters early in the integration process, getting them involved early, having a tight linkage between terminal developers and platform integration engineers and the warfighter, I think is really critical. And then as we consider very, very strongly bringing a lot of new commercial capability into this environment, we have to make sure that, I think, we're going to have to be savvy about the market, and we're going to have to make sure that business cases close for our commercial providers, so that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we're counting on something where the either changes paths or potentially goes out of business or whatever. We've got, as I mentioned earlier about SPEC, Space Enterprise Consortium, we have a lot of commercial vendors that we're trying to work with, 36 different projects on SPEC, 69 different awards. coming up on $1 billion worth of value, and 80% of those members are non-traditional defense contractors, a lot of them with commercial things. I think everybody's familiar with our Space Pitch Day events last November, where we awarded upwards of $45 million to 30 different providers of unique space capabilities. A lot of those were non-traditional or commercial vendors. For those of you who are tracking this, we're very much looking forward to doing a Space Pitch Day event later this year. We'll try and make it annually. We've got a lot of work to go on that in the COVID-19 environment and some other things. So I can only tell you now that we're working something for the fall timeframe. But a ton of commercial work in launch and a number of our other mission areas that we've absolutely got to get better at and take advantage of that commercial innovation in the U.S. industrial base, not just the space industrial base. Over.
Well, thank you. The launch of ORS-5 last year was seen as a really big success for operationally responsive space. How has SMC leveraged that success, and what further progress has been made with regard to operationally responsive space?
Yeah, so Dave, as you know, we transitioned the organization that built ORS-5, we transitioned the operationally responsive space program into the space RCO. And so Mr. Mike Roberts and his team have picked up the mantle in the highly classified world of continuing that lineage of producing capability for the warfighter quickly, and in his case, in a highly classified environment. But more broadly across the center, innovation and prototyping is one of our key tenets right now. So as we move forward with a number of our Section 804 middle tier acquisition programs, as we move forward with tactically responsive launch efforts, some of which we can talk about and some of which we can't talk about, I think that the lineage of successful, quick programs that field Class D satellites that don't have the same kind of level of mission assurance as like a Class A satellite, like a AEHF or a SIBRS or a GPS bird would have to have, I think is absolutely the way forward to make sure that we're fielding capability in a not too risk averse environment that is prototyping, innovating, and still has operational relevance as we begin to put it on orbit.
Well, very good, JT. Thanks very much again for your comments on these critical issues and everything else that you and your organization is doing to advance the nation's capabilities in space. So on behalf of the Mitchell Institute and AFA writ large, we wish you all the best of success and hope that you continue to find it as you deal with the challenges that affect our nation's security. As a reminder to our listeners, Mitchell will be doing a virtual release of our newest research report tomorrow at 2 p.m. entitled Long Range Strike, Resetting the Balance of Stand-in and Standoff Forces. And our next Aerospace Nation event will be with General Mobile Holmes, Commander of Air Combat Command, on Monday, the 22nd of June.